before sunrise on a mild summer morning in June 1995. A 27-year-old television news anchor named Jodi hurriedly left her apartment in Mason City, Iowa, headed for work. But she never arrived, and her disappearance has never been solved. In 2003, two television news reporters created FindJodi.com, a website dedicated to preserving Jodi's memory and keeping her case alive. This is the official Find Jodi podcast. Thank you for downloading the Find Jodi podcast. Thank you for listening, and welcome to episode 3. What you'll hear today is a roundtable conversation as the Find Jodi team reflects on 25 years. The 25th anniversary of Jodi's disappearance is today as of this recording. In fact, the audio for this episode will be released into the feed 25 years to the moment when police showed up at Jodi Huisentruit's apartment complex to find that she was missing and that something terrible had happened to her. And precisely what and who was responsible for Jodi's disappearance has remained obviously a mystery for 25 years since then. So earlier this week, we got together for a roundtable discussion, just a reflection of the 25 years since the case began, but also the 15 or so years since Josh Benson and Gary Peterson founded FindJodi.com in 2003. So this episode obviously will be different than the narrative episodes that we've brought you so far. And along those lines, we talk about some content here in this episode that we haven't gotten to yet in the narrative form of the podcast. So if you feel as though you're confused or missing out about some aspects of the case that we talk about here, rest assured that we will get to them in upcoming episodes of the podcast. Joining me for this episode will be Josh Benson, who is the co-founder of FindJodi.com. He and his wife, Manis Benson. Tara's on this episode as well. She was the original first team member after Josh and Gary founded the site. They and their family live in Florida. Caroline Lowe joins us for this discussion from the Bay Area of San Francisco. You'll hear again from Jay Alberio in this conversation. Jay lives in either Minnesota or Florida, whichever has the better conditions for golf at different times of the year. And myself, I live full-time in Minnesota. And along those lines, early in the episode, we talk a little about the challenges and the circumstances of us collaborating across time zones. And one of those things popped up in a technical forum while recording the podcast. It wasn't until after we were done recording that I realized that my audio was not on mic. Fortunately, the rest of the team was, so they sound great. My audio is going to sound like I'm on a Skype call. Hopefully not too distracting, but if you notice that, that's what that was. My error, and of course the podcast guru of the group is the one to make it. But it was great for the team to get together and reflect on what 25 years since Jodi's disappearance has meant. We hope you enjoy the conversation. I feel as a longtime reader of Find Jodi, well before I joined the team, I was just interested to listen to the rest of the team talk and reflect. So hopefully, regardless of how long you've been a reader or a listener to FindJodi.com or the podcast, hopefully you get something out of this conversation. And hopefully it helps you to think about Jodi on this day, especially the 25th anniversary of her disappearance on June 27th, 1995.
I was a lot younger then, now that you mentioned that. 2003, that was a long time ago. Yeah, just a quick recap. Gary was my boss back in 2002 when I got a job at KAAL in Austin, Minnesota. It was my first TV job. I was getting into TV news. That was my first job. He hired me. And what we found right out of the gate is that we both had kind of a passion for missing person cases. At the time, there was a lot of missing male college students in Minnesota, and what seemed to be a trend, and we thought it was a serial killer, or we were trying to figure out what was going on. So we had that in the nightly news down in Austin. And what was interesting is we both found out we were just fascinated by this case. And so we got to talking about it, and he talked about one of the bigger missing person cases in the Midwest was Jodi Huisentruit. And I had known about that case several years earlier when she disappeared. I remember I was at home and we saw it come on ABC World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. We used to watch that at dinner, and that's when I learned about the case. He had received a correspondence in the mail from a psychic saying, I'm offering a free reading on a case. And just for fun, we sent it off. And we said, let's look into Jodi's case. So this guy sent back a very detailed breakdown of clues on what he thought happened to Jodi. And it sent us, it sent locations all around southern Minnesota, and North Iowa. So we kind of looked into some of these places. Gary even took some trips down to certain lakes and followed the blueprint. But we found that case was really fascinating, and we wanted to learn more about it. So we really dug in and started just interviewing people in Austin, in Mason City, and that's really when we got started. And we took a trip down through Iowa and interviewed authorities, people connected to the case, friends, witnesses, so to speak. That's how it was born. And we created a 13-part series called the Who's in Truth Files that actually aired on Channel 6 at the time. We did a half-hour special. And from that point forward, we created the website, and it took off from there. Now we're here that many years later.
All these years later, that series was my first introduction to the case ever 10 years ago. And I'm sure it's a lot of people's first introduction just on YouTube and FindJodi. Kind of crazy to think that work you did so long ago that spawned the website. It's also still to this day, it stands up as how a lot of people are introduced to Jodi's case.
It was very scrutinized back then from the lawyers for the station we worked for. I mean, we couldn't just put this together and run it on the air. We had to go through the script line by line. I remember sitting with the attorneys and going through the scripts, and we edited ourselves. It was a lot of fun. We learned a lot. I mean, it taught me a lot about journalism, and we were really proud of it in the end because I feel like it was a really complete picture of the Jodi case and people that were related to it.
So for a long time, it was you and Gary and a website, right? Because you had the passion for web design, so you developed. I would love to see a screenshot of the 2003 FindJodi.com.
I have it too. I will post that just for you.
That'd be fun.
It's nasty. Actually, it's not that bad. Actually, it was pretty good for the time. So I will find that.
Things were not that far along, so it would have to be pretty bad. We all remember how the internet was. Then Tara, now your wife you meet. And how did she become involved in the team, aside from just marrying into the team, I suppose? But she shares the interest. Tara, you share an interest in missing persons that we've talked about on the podcast. Personally curious, at what point in the relationship between you two did the Jodi case become introduced?
It was before we were even together. It was actually just when we were working together as friends, and we both started talking. We were obviously on the Casey Anthony case and doing stuff of that sort. He started mentioning, I've got this nonprofit, and there's a missing anchor woman out of Iowa that case has been, obviously, it's a big part of my life. And so we started talking a little more and got us on a 3-way call with Gary and Josh and myself, and just started making notes. I still have that yellow notepad, that legal notepad, where we just started writing down names and all the people that, we were going to look into, leads that had just kind of gone cold and things that they wanted to just kind of dig on. So that's where we really started. And that was before we even went on our first date. So
that's kind of a cool thing to share.
I don't remember it that way, but maybe that was the case.
Oh, really?
It was very early on. Yeah.
It was November 2010, and that was far before we were together.
See, the thing about Tara is she knows her dates
She's
to the
got the
T.
notepad.
I could ask her what happened 13 years ago yesterday, and she'll know exactly what happened. It's freakish, but I'm glad she knows, and I have no clue.
Caroline is the next team member that's with us.
So when Caroline came aboard, that was something that was actually a pretty big surprise to me, because Caroline, I grew up watching. Caroline was, I'm gonna build your head here, Caroline. Caroline was a huge deal in the Twin Cities when it came to crime reporting.
You're also aging me by this, but anyway.
No, I mean, you got a couple of years, but not that many more than me. But I remember, because I was so fascinated with journalism, but watching Caroline, she covered everything. I mean, she was a big deal when it came to crime reporting. Everybody knew who she was. She was on WCCO. She had, these in-depth reports that really got to the heart of these stories. And I remembered when we were in discussion about her coming on the team, I'm like, I don't think she's going to do it, but then she was totally pumped to do it. So we were actually very excited to bring her aboard. I remember when she came on board and we had a big press release, and I knew that she was really invested in Jodi's case because she had covered it in the past. And I saw the work she did on Jacob Wetterling's case, which is another huge case when it comes to missing person cases in the Midwest. Now that one has resolution. Jodi's case doesn't. And, Caroline's a very tenacious reporter. So knowing that she was coming aboard, she wasn't going to be leaving anytime soon until this thing was solved. So that was really a good thing for us when she came on board, and we were totally pumped about it.
What Caroline did for WCCO for so long, you guys know as well as anybody, but that doesn't exist. That person, that position doesn't exist as much, hardly anywhere probably in the country as it did at like a local news level back then.
Well, I hope that if some young reporters are listening to this, that they will not let the constraints, the demands keep them from doing that. A lot of what I did, I'd have to do the daily story. And then I would, when I was done with that story, I'd make some calls or work on the deeper ones because we really didn't have all that many resources, even at CCO on it. But if I found a good story, I found something they're interested in, then they'd let me get some time off to work on it. But I spent a lot of time doing it at home, doing like Tara's doing now with juggling kids and things. But I became very close to victims' families. And if anything, it made me obsessed with trying to get answers and trying to get some resolution. And we know the power of the media to cover a story, to get a case moved to the top of the pile. I interviewed Patty Wetterling a few months ago, and she was talking about advice to families who are looking for help. She said, you need to be noisy. You need to keep bugging those reporters to not let your case fade. And anyway, that became my passion. I started covering Jodi. It was about 2 years after she was abducted. Never imagined that 23 years later, I'd be standing in a closet in California where I have my podcast set up, taking care of my grandbaby during the day, a couple days a week. But I just got really hooked on it. And you get close to the families. I got to know Jodi's sister back then, Jodi's mom. I promised her mom I would stay on the case, try to get her answers before she passed away. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And then after covering it for many years, I moved to California in 2011 to take a management position, take a different position out here. And I felt Jacob, as you mentioned, Jacob Wetterling and Jodi stayed with me. So it meant so much to me when Josh reached out and asked if I'd be willing to join the Jodi team and keep on it. There are challenges, as we'll talk about today. I mean, we are on 3 different time zones. We are all over the place. And there's certainly it's not the easiest thing to do, but it allows me to stay on the trail. And I just hope before I'm ready to put my feet up on a beach or whatever, we can do the final chapter in what happened to Jodi.
And then Josh, we bring in Jay too as sequentially the next member of the team. Jay Alberio, very useful in my conversations with Jay every single time, Jay, just the way you look at things as an investigator, slightly different than most journalists. So Josh, how did Jay come on board and what does he bring to the team?
That was another exciting part for us. Jay's a bulldog. He's got that law enforcement background. My brother's a law enforcement, and they're cut from the same cloth, which is cool to see because I can make comparisons from growing up with somebody in law enforcement to someone like Jay, who was a commander and he worked on this case extensively as well. So to have someone like Jay come on board who has familiarity with the case was something very special. 27 years, I think it was, Jay. I'll let you tell your story. But when he came on board, it was a whole new dimension for our team because we're all journalists. Tara and Caroline was Beth Bednar. We were all journalists at the time. Gary, all former TV. That's what we knew. We knew how to dig into a story, but we worked with law enforcement. But ironically, we covered law enforcement on the spectrum. Down here in Florida, we would break up police departments just due to criminal activity. So we found that law enforcement had the gamut, and we needed somebody we could trust who really knew the case and had a great proven track record. And Jay was that guy. And when he said yes too, we were very excited, and it offered up that missing piece that we needed for the organization. So we were super excited.
Yeah, and when I got interested in the case, it was actually my introduction to Caroline Lowe. And I'd seen Caroline do some investigative reports. And it was 1997, and the arrest of Tony Jackson here in Minneapolis, St. Paul area, the serial rapist. And we made that connection to Jodi down in Mason City. And I sent a large file down to Mason City Police, and we weren't getting anywhere. And in law enforcement, there's times that we can use media to get some work done. And I was working with a St. Paul sex crimes investigator, Craig Brackman. I said, we need to get some media to put some pressure on Mason City. And he gave Caroline my information. I do believe that's right, Caroline. If I'm not,
correct.
Correct that. But yeah, so she reached out to me and we got talking about the case and she did the story on it. And she was able to get a lot more information on Tony Jackson and his possible involvement down there in Mason City. So I was really impressed with her work, and she told me about FindJodi years later. And we kept in contact over the years, what we thought was going on. She went out to California, and we still kept in contact. And I was nearing retirement, and I thought, maybe I could help out. I was a little intimidated working with journalists and thinking, well, how can I add anything to this team of journalists? And as Caroline and I talked, I thought, well, maybe I can bring something to the team. Maybe my investigative skills and experience, my inner workings with law enforcement might add something to the team. And I hope it has. It's been still a big interest for me. And my wife keeps asking me, so what keeps you going on this? And in law enforcement, no officer, no investigator wants to see a case go unsolved. And we've had cases in Woodbury that never got solved. And so part of me is like, I want to see this thing through. I always was an advocate for victims and was there and to try to bring a resolution to a situation. And that's what keeps me going still in this case.
I was going to mention the reason we were looking at Jackson at the time is as Jay did some of the background after Jackson was arrested for several rapes in the Twin Cities. They found out he was actually living in Mason City at the time Jodi disappeared. So it's one of those things where we had no idea if he was connected or not, but certainly says take a look. We felt it needed a closer look than it appeared to be getting from Mason City.
I'd like to add, too, that I have actually met with the Mason City investigators up here in Minnesota and Woodbury when we gave them information on Tony Jackson. They came up, met with them. And some of the things that they said to me just didn't strike me as quite right. And that's another motivating factor for me to keep involved in this. Some of the things they said that they had their person. And it really kind of, in law enforcement, you got to look at all the different persons of interest. We've talked to people in this case, and there's people that have never been interviewed by the Mason City Police that have information, that had information. So it's a frustration on our part. Caroline is, a big pusher, and she's always challenging me and keeping me on track and keeps me involved.
Along those lines, people often ask, who do you think did it? Because certain names keep popping up over and over. And I know we're going to be dealing more with specifics of people of interest in a future podcast. But I say my current person is none of the above. I have seen too many cases, including in Jacob Wetterling, where law enforcement has been locked into somebody. I stood at the end of the driveway of a man who was a suspect in Jacob Wetterling's abduction and murder. And I watched them dig up the ground. And then a couple of years later, it turned out he had nothing to do with it. It was somebody else that after the 25th anniversary of Jacob's disappearance, law enforcement took another look. They developed some evidence that eventually led them to the person who abducted Jacob. So I say you got to keep an open mind. And just because until we see evidence, until we see arrests, I think our position at FindJodi is we don't know, none of the above.
That's a great point to make because so many people in this day and age are so quick to accuse or to charge somebody saying this is the guy who did it or this is the gal who did it. And that's just not the case. I mean, that's why it's so important to step back and take a look. I mean, that's a good point, Caroline, because that's the number one question I get. Who do you think did it? And I've never to this day given a name because every time I start to zero in on somebody, we get a lead or we get something to the website that says, check this out. We check into it like, wow, this is completely out of left field. I had never seen this situation before. And my mind has changed 50 times, which is frustrating.
And one of the things we have found out, and we can perhaps deal with this in a future episode, is there was a lot of stuff going on in Mason City back then. The amount of people in a town of 28,000, you had someone involved in killing 5 people, Dustin Honkin. You had a few years later a police officer charged with sexual assault. How do you not take a look at anybody who's capable of violence and wonder where were they? Do they have an alibi? Could they be connected? You have to look at everybody. And maybe there's somebody who is visiting somebody in the apartment building we've never heard about. I keep holding that, kind of trying to force myself to keep open for that option.
You got to keep an open mind. It could be somebody that's already been interviewed. It could be somebody that's never been interviewed, or they might not be in that file. But deep down in those pages and pages of information, that person's name may already be in the file. But like Josh and Caroline said, you can't come out and say, I believe it's this person.
Caroline, I
think a
just want to
huge-
ask, how far did your jaw drop when you found out about Jacob Wetterling? There's somebody, like you said, there's somebody they zeroed in on so much, and then all of a sudden it was...
I visited with that man, Dan Rassier. I had coffee with him after they made the development. And I remember I'll tell you, to be honest, I was in tears after spending 3 hours with him. I thought, look what he went through. I stood across from his property and it looked bad. Things he said didn't look good, as we later learned, but he was innocent. And to me, that was the second tragedy. Obviously, the huge tragedy, what happened to Jacob and Jacob's family, what they went through. But to think an innocent man had lived 27 plus years with this cloud hanging over him for something he didn't have anything to do with. And I've had some other ones like that over the years, because most of the time the person you hear about turns out to be the one who committed the crime. But I've seen enough other ones that it's told me, and particularly in Jacob's case, don't get locked into something. It's important the media ask questions, say, what is the evidence? And what we're up against is we usually don't get to see the evidence, so we don't know until the case is done. But it was very jarring. But in terms of my reaction, I was in San Francisco visiting our son, and I got this call that Jacob had been found, and I couldn't believe it. Then I had to call Patty Wetterling. It was one of the hardest calls I've ever had to make to see if this was accurate. And I texted her, and she got back to me, and she said, she could confirm that he was. And it was horrible. Wow. I just sat there sort of shaking. It's like I never kind of imagined that day. And we lived that with Jodi. I had a Jacob go bag. I now have a Jodi go bag that we get that call. You can elaborate on a tip we had a few months ago. We thought that maybe this was it when they found some remains in the Cedar Rapids area, and we all kicked in high gear. We did, we went to it. Fortunately, someone in law enforcement confirmed fairly quickly that it was not, in fact, Jodi. And I was able to let Jodi's family know, because, they live with this, I think it's called ambiguous loss, always wondering and not really knowing. As awful as it will be to know what happened to Jodi, believe it's worse to have to keep living with all these scenarios, keep waiting for that phone to ring, where they just want to say goodbye to her. They want her home, and they want to say goodbye to Jodi.
And I think that's a good point you bring up too, because a lot of people in the past, Scott, when we started this site and we reported on just anything and everything we could, from a journalistic standpoint, we looked into it and confirmed the facts before we posted it. But we posted a lot because there was so little with the case. And so we were accused early on to say, oh, you guys are just trying to hype this case and just trying to, get people rattled up, when it wasn't the issue at all. Now that we're 20 years into this, we're so good at finding the details quickly, like Caroline just alluded to. We found out about this lead in Cedar Rapids. We had the discussion on if we're going to post any information on it. We wanted to be very upfront and transparent about what we knew. We had already made contact with law enforcement on a high level to find out, hey, this is not related to Jodi. And we were quick to update the story to ensure that, hey, this is something that we looked into. It's not Jodi. And that's important to note, because this isn't just a side blog that we just kind of run and gun and post everything that comes at us. There's a process at which we follow. It's very fact-based. It's journalistic integrity. And we want to make sure that we uphold that every time there's a new lead that comes into play.
Right. This isn't clickbait,
No,
you can look at sites that will just post things because they want to get some clicks. We aren't doing it for that. We're doing it because we really want to find answers. And if there is something that we think, hey, people might be interested in the local area, especially if they hear about, a body being found or whatever, we want to make sure we do post it and give some context, because this is on everyone's mind, I think, in the entire area, in Minnesota, in Iowa. It's always going to be there. And until she's found, I think that it won't go away.
I think an interesting connection to that was, I remember a news conference that happened when we were in Austin. The Cerro Gordo County Sheriff came on, and a body had been found. I'm trying to remember the details, but it was in a ravine, and the body was about 95, the remains. They had determined, when this person died. And we're like, well, this has to be Jodi, 95. Then the only other option was a person who disappeared like a month before Jodi. His name was James Perkins, I believe, at the time. So all they had to determine was it was a male or female. And the chief at the time came out, and we were all packed into this room. Twin Cities was down. They had all their reporters there. And I remember they opened up for questions, and the first guy was a reporter. I remember him from Twin Cities. He blurted out, he's like, is it Jodi Huisentruit? He's like, no, it's not. It's a male, and we found these remains, and it turned out being somebody who disappeared literally within a month or two of Jodi. So, I mean, that just tells you the dynamic of this case, how people are so amped up about it. The facts are so important because so many people could have run with the fact that, hey, they found Jodi who isn't true. And not to discredit this other case in any means. I mean, this was a person who lost his life. It was an awful situation. And we did stories on that after the fact. But to be missing a month before Jodi is just how weird this case gets.
There actually have been serious major developments in Jodi's case, from the journal that we talked about in the last podcast episode to things we haven't talked about yet in depth, like Officer Maria Ohl's claim, all the way up to 6 months ago, the Find Jodi billboards in Mason City are vandalized, which may or may not be related. But a lot of cold cases, there aren't these major developments, like something as strange as the journals.
Lots of rabbit holes, and we've spent 90%, I think, of what we worked on, you'll never see on our site because they didn't go anywhere. If this site didn't exist, if Find Jodi didn't exist, if Josh and Gary had not created this in 2003, I don't know who would be out there other than the basics of what law enforcement do. Who would be a voice for Jodi? It's kept it out there. They created something before you had the current genre of citizen investigators. They were the first. They were the real deal. And I was so impressed with what they did with the Hughes and Truth files and everything else without the resources that, frankly, I had at WCCO. It's amazing what they did. And I don't know how I would be working on it today if we didn't have this organization. It'd be tough to do in California without this. So they have contributed a huge part of whatever happens eventually in finding Jodi.
It's a very special organization as well, and that we're all dedicated to one case. It was a passion of yours, Josh, and then you've brought other people into it. There have to be times over the course of that 15 years where, for whatever reason or another, it just becomes too much, and this is, for whatever reason or another, a headache. But to your credit, you've brought other people in and you haven't stopped. So in that sense of just the organization, what has kept you going since 2003?
That is a good question, because at the older you get, the harder it gets. The more responsibilities you get, kids, the jobs. I mean, it gets to be a lot. What's hard to digest is the fact we're looking at 25 years. You know, early on, we were young and cocky and thinking, hey, we could get this solved in a few years if we really put our work into it. And I thought maybe at the time, me being in mid-20s with that mindset, that was a possibility in our minds. But it's really humbling to sit here now having this discussion on this day, 25 years later, when she disappeared, to say, hey, there's been developments, but we don't have the guy. We don't have the plot. We don't have Jodi. We don't have any of it. And that's frustrating. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a mix of stubbornness. It's a mix of frustration. I get fueled by frustration more than anything because I feel like I want to get this resolved. Like Caroline said, she said, you know, we want to get this solved for the family. I think about the family a lot. It's a culmination of a lot of things, but it's a challenge. Like you say, it can be a headache. It can be a lot of things. But I think we've built something special here, and I think that's why we keep going, because look at the people we're working with. All you guys in the team have been solid. You've stepped up to help. And I think just based on the feedback of people on Facebook, on the website, the leads we get in, the feedback, whether it's positive or negative, that's all helpful. You know, the billboards generated a ton of leads, and whether they're the one or not, it's all helpful information because people are still thinking about it. And I think good police work, along with people who don't give up, can solve cases 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years later.
I've been asked a couple of times this week. I'm never sure how to answer this question, but as we lead up to the anniversary, people ask me the question they have to ask, which is, do you think this case is going to be solved? That's a difficult question to give an honest answer to because most of it's hope. But you bring up Jacob, and then there are cases like we just had in Waterloo. Turns out a serial killer of 3 women at least had been living there for quite some time. Those cases are 28 years old, older than Jodi's. So I'll put it to the group. Do you think this case is going to be solved?
I would say, as you mentioned with Jacob, that gave me hope that if you asked me the same question 5 years ago, I don't know that I would have been as hopeful, because the challenges of a case like Jodi's or Jacob's is you don't have the victim. You don't have a crime scene. Many of the things you're hearing about nowadays are great advances in DNA and all that, but we had very little evidence in this case. Very, very little. So it's until we find Jodi and maybe have additional evidence from a second crime scene. This is tough. This is really tough. But I can't imagine walking away from it. I just feel this when I go in the past month, 2 months, I've been looking at old clippings. I've gone through the newspaper archives, looking at something, keep thinking, is there something there that I've missed? Maybe somebody I need to call, maybe somebody we need to reach out to. And it kind of keeps us going. We do a post and then maybe we'll hear from somebody. A couple days ago, I was interviewed by a reporter anchor in Georgia who had nothing to do with Jodi, and he inspired me. He's in a tiny market, and he just says he feels a connection because Jodi was doing what he does, the morning show and the noon show. And again, Jodi was doing what most of us did, working in journalism, and I can't imagine walking away from it.
I agree with you, Caroline, and we can't give up hope. If we gave up hope, we wouldn't have the website. We wouldn't have this team going forward, keeping it alive. So we got to hold that hope out, and I think it will be solved someday. You hear about it all the time. Cases older than Jodi's case are being solved. So, we got to hold that hope out there, and we'll get a break someday. The Mason City Police will have somebody come forward and come with that one piece of evidence that's going to break the case wide open.
I think that Josh and Gary just did so much at the beginning and have put in so much time and so many years. So it's almost impossible for them to let go of this because they were the last hope, until this team came together. And as excited as everyone gets, when something does come in, it's uplifting. It's gets all of us a little fire lit. But I think more than anything, we have 2 daughters now, and we both have worked that shift, and we both think about, what if our kids go into journalism, and what if they're working at 3 a.m. and they're going into their car? I do think about that. I think that it makes it difficult to let go, because if something ever happened to them, I don't know what, I do know what we would do. It wouldn't be good. It would be this. I mean, we'd until the end. I mean, right. you can't stop.
We haven't talked much about Gary, but Gary was the driving force behind this whole organization. I mean, I've trudged through farm fields with this guy. We have been in barns. We have been in garages in the middle of winter and 20-degree weather, looking through boxes of old crap from people who are persons of interest.
Under homes.
We've been we were under Jodi's apartment, digging up mounds of dirt with the sergeant of the police department. I mean, I could tell you stories that go back 15 years of just the ridiculous things that we've been doing. We had ground penetrating radar. We had bulldozers come in and dig up holes. I mean, these are all instances of time that we just spent thinking that was it. Like, let's get this done. Gary put in so much time and effort, and his case file is enormous. And he recently retired. He knew it was time to retire. He said, we've been crushing on this case for so long. And I totally get it. I totally get his decision to do that, and I can totally understand and respect everything he has done and the work we put into it as partners. It was so good to work with him over these years. But you talk about how you'd feel if this were to happen, as Tara just brought up. I have a co-anchor in my first market, that same market, Channel 6. She was my co-anchor, and her daughter disappeared. Currently is missing, and this happened in February. And I go on Facebook, and she's pleading with the world to help her find her daughter. The daughter disappeared. She left, I don't know the exact details, but went out one night and never came home. And here's a woman I worked with. I mean, to think about somebody you don't know that well, to miss. And I've always said to myself, the worst pain in the world would have to be to lose a child and not know exactly what happened, just up and vanished. And for this to happen to somebody I know, and to see the reminders it's like you almost want to push it out of your mind, because you don't want to live the hell and the pain that person's living. But you have to be compassionate to say, how are they moving on? Because if it happened to me, I tell you, it wouldn't probably be a good ending. I would want to think I was strong enough to keep going. I know Tara would probably build an army and attack the entire world in search of our daughters, because she's that aggressive, and that's why I love her. But to lose a child is unfathomable. So to go back, why you think I still do this, I think that's a big part of it. It's just something that I couldn't imagine dealing with. So we're fighting for the families, and we're fighting for Jodi's family, and I think that's what keeps us fueled.
I feel we kind of have an obligation. We've had great lives. We've got great experiences. We know how to get coverage. We know how to get their story out. We know how to get Jodi's story. And I just feel it's the right thing to do, to tap into what we have skills at and keeping Jodi in the spotlight. We also every one of us is a digger. So you got the combination of knowing how to keep it visible and that thirst for answers, thirst for bringing justice, for bringing Jodi home, just stays with you. You just can't shake it.
You know, what's frustrating about this too is you wish that this would have happened in the present time, because you walk anywhere for 100 yards, how many cameras pick you up these days? Mm-hmm. And there's no cameras back then. If this happened yesterday, this case would have been solved probably tomorrow.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And that's the thing. That's the frustration of dealing with mid-90s. It's like technology never caught up. We were waiting.
She didn't have an iPhone that was tracking everything she was doing. She didn't have an Apple Watch.
Right.
All these
social media
used. Right.
Instagram postings. Where was she?
Right.
Exactly. Her emails to check who was writing to her, what we were going through at that day, on that day. Track her internet history, track other people's internet history, all these people that have come up as potential persons of interest. So it's just heartbreaking.
But that's why the little evidence we do have is so important to us. You know, Scott, we talked about the journal, we talked about the videotape of the party. There's not a lot to work with here. And so when you talk about things like the journal being leaked, and you talk about the party video getting, released to somebody else.
No, I mean, that's worth bringing up, because we didn't touch on that in the Journal podcast episode, but talking about what's happened over the span of FindJodi. So we've seen the journal be leaked to a newspaper by the wife of a former police chief, which is
unbelievable.
Yeah, but
to
not
put it
just
bluntly,
that, but also most recently, you've been in pursuit of this birthday party video that is supposedly the subject of what John Van Cise says he's watching with Jodi at his house the night before she disappears. Everyone's wanted to see it, whatever in the world's on it. And all of a sudden, a documentary comes out on Oxygen where there are clips of this birthday video that you've been looking for years.
Right.
So we have the journal, we have the birthday party video that have walked out of the Mason City Police Department, and there is no follow-up action on either. When both of these are potentially very sensitive, important pieces of evidence.
Right.
And I think that undermines sometimes the community's confidence when you think these are two very important pieces of evidence that got out. How did that happen? And I know for Jodi's family, having the journal release was very violating. There was Jodi's words, all that release. And then with the video, it got out. And I was kind of surprised. We were wondering if there'd be an internal investigation when the video got out, as there was when the journal got out. But the chief said when we reached out to him, they didn't think it would be the best use of their resources. So we don't know exactly where they got the video. We asked if we could now get a copy and put it out publicly, thinking maybe somebody might recognize something. And so far, they have turned down our request to see it.
Coming from law enforcement, those are embarrassing moments, leaks that happen like that. But one of the things it does do, it not only sometimes it can lead to a suspect, but things like that can also help eliminate suspects or persons of interest in those cases. You're looking at the content of the journal, the birthday video. Those can also help clear somebody. It's not something you want to experience in your career as a law enforcement officer, having those types of leaks go out.
And the response to both of those leaks were basically what's in the past is in the past. Like when the journal came out, no crime was committed. Something tells me if I, as a private citizen, had been somehow responsible for that leak, I would have gotten a different response. But it adds to our frustration from the outside looking in, because they have been tight-lipped about their investigation to preserve whatever evidence remains, which you can appreciate and understand that. But if simultaneous to that there are these leaks happening and they're apparently not responded to by the department, it comes off as apathy. It's hard from the outside when Mason City has a long distrust of its police department. Anyway, going back to pre-Jodi, was the reason for Chief Schleiper coming into Mason City in the first place back in 95, was to reform the department from the outside. And from that day on, Jodi's case not helping any of this, there has been that, distrust. And when the current administration locks it down, basically, the public is left to nothing but speculation to fill that void.
And what's frustrating is that this over the time that Jodi disappeared to now, there's been several administrations, 4 chiefs, and we've worked with several different investigators on the case. I remember early on, I think point blank, we went in to say, hey, we'd love to get in the evidence room and sit down with you and brainstorm to see if we could, collaborate here and try to share notes. They said absolutely not. And as a young journalist, you're like, well, that sucks. I think we could have brought a lot to the table, but I respect their opinion. Okay. But then to see the Twin Cities media come down and have evidence photos of the drag marks that I had never seen before, this blew my mind as a young journalist to say, man, I asked for that, and I asked for these details early on, was told no, and then I'm seeing it on a bigger market media station. That's something early on that really got me thinking, what is going on here? And then, Scott, to your point, to see things walk out of the evidence room, whether it's from the Mason City Police Department or not, wherever this source came from, that these are things that have crossed paths with us that has always been of interest and confusion for me specifically.
Josh, as you touched on, the things have gotten out. There's been an inconsistent pattern. Sometimes in 2005, on the 10-year anniversary, I got some of those photos. I think you're referring to the crime scene photos. They haven't released them since. Early on, they've said certain things, and then stories changed. Sometimes they've said there's no blood evidence. There is blood. They wouldn't answer the question whether there's blood evidence. Other times they would say there's no blood evidence. So it's that inconsistent pattern we have seen over the years that's been frustrating, especially now as we're kind of going through archiving and cataloging everything. A lot of inconsistencies.
And one more note I just want to bring up that's important is you look at the different chiefs that came in, and each chief that came in was new to the case who had to get comfortable with the case file. And I noticed earlier on, Chief Brinkley, when we first met him, we had a great introduction. We had a great conversation. He said he was going to dive into the case file. And to his credit, he said he did it and he researched it. But also with the people who were involved in the case the most, Lieutenant Van de Weerd and Stearns has probably from the very beginning, both have since retired. So now here you have some of the deepest veterans in the case of the department retiring. They're out of the picture at this point. You have some of the investigators who've been on several years, but again, we've worked with 3, 4, 5 investigators assigned to Jodi's case. Every time new people come in, that's a learning curve. Scott, thankfully, you were following up on the case. When you joined the team, you had a really deep knowledge of the case. But if we were to bring in somebody brand new, think of the time and effort they would have to take to catch up. And I think that's a disadvantage for the case, especially for a police department who's managing the investigation.
It's a long, twisted case, and there are a lot of layers to it, too. But, Jay, I wanted to ask you specific to the Jodi case, a question I get all the time. And so from your law enforcement perspective, what is the harm in releasing some of the evidence that they have 25 years on?
I'm glad you asked that because I've been pondering that. What would it harm at this point? We're 25 years after Jodi's disappearance. I can understand holding one key thing back that only the perpetrator would know. If it was my case, I would lay more facts out there. I would lay more, this is the evidence that we have, just more key information, because that can only help your case. It might help jog somebody's memory. It might lead to additional tips, additional witnesses. So I really personally don't think by holding everything back that it's helping their cause. I think it's doing more harm. It's preventing the case from being solved or preventing to get additional information. And like I said, if there's that only one piece that only the perpetrator would know, hold that back. But if you got multitude of pieces of evidence, the more information out there, I think the better. And that's when the environment in law enforcement these days is being more transparent. You're hearing that with everything that's going on in the country these days. The onset of body cameras for law enforcement, people are always, well, why? They're afraid to have those. It's being transparent. We shouldn't have anything to hide. We do our job. We do it right. You do it with dignity to victims and respect, and you have nothing to hide. And I think Mason City needs to come out and be a little more transparent of what's going on.
So I guess the nightmare possibility, I suppose it is possible that 95% of what's in the case file we already know, which I think is a worst case scenario for Jodi's case.
Well, if you go back to the 2004 interview that Josh and Gary did with Ron Vanderweerd, maybe Josh can elaborate, but he said that the problem is they had very little evidence, and he felt what little they had, they did not want to share. And I don't know if that stuff that he didn't share then would include, perhaps now that we know about the birthday party video, maybe it's the journal. What did they have that they didn't want to share? But it was clear they did not have much evidence.
I always have visions of a deer hunter coming across remains or a deathbed confession. These are all things I play in my mind, like who's going to pass away and get a guilty conscience last second and say, here's where she is. Those are far-fetched, pie in the sky dreams that probably will never happen. If you asked me in the mid-20s, I said absolutely, because you're cocky and you think you're going to solve it. If you asked me in my 40s, which is such a crazy time difference, I'm not so sure. I'm honestly not so sure it's going to get solved.
But going back to the Jacob Wetterling case, I believe his remains have been moved, but they were always there theoretically for someone to find, right? They were outside.
They were buried. They were basically in a shallow area of a farm. But as I said, the person who killed him never left the area.
Right.
And
there's a lot of farmland here for Jodi to be.
Well, we saw just a couple of years ago, a former police officer from Oklahoma who turned out to be a suicide, but her remains were found and been on a farm in Mason City for 10 years. So could turn out to be right there. And you wonder, how could that be possible?
I think a lot of our listeners right now who are big true crime listeners who are into this type of genre, I mean, how many cases have you heard of where the end was basically really close to where the crime occurred? I mean, it happens a lot more than you think. The body could be within a few miles. It could be like you said, somebody who lives close by who never moved. Mm-hmm. The problem is we always think about these leads that come in and think, all right, think way outside. Think, this could, we have a tip in Alaska. We have a tip in Europe. We have a tip in Mexico. Jodi was here. You get your mind starts wandering, and then you lose focus of the fact that let's look at a mile or 2 or 5 from Mason City from the key apartments. Let's start in the middle and let's work out. That's the hardest thing to keep focused because your mind's being drawn in so many different directions. Pretty soon you're like way off in Egypt and you're not thinking about where this could have actually happened. Yeah. And in the end, when a lot of these cases get solved, it's ridiculous how many are solved really close by.
That's why I think the billboards were so important when we came up with that 2 years ago, because they're right there. They're a reminder to people in town. And we've talked about this before. I think there's a very good chance that the answer to what happened to Jodi is still in the Mason City area. And that's why when the local stations there cover it, local media, I think it's more important, frankly, than any of the national shows. It stirs things up, get a lot of attention. But I think the answers are very likely right in the backyard, Mason City or in southern Minnesota.
To shift up a little bit, some of the other aspects of the site over the years, tips in general and stuff that has come in from the public and these theories, some of them are way out there and probably not accurate, but Josh and for everybody, I guess, but from the beginning, like what's that been like? Because it's a unique part of FindJodi, I think, still to this day, the interaction, the tips that come in and the forums when they were active.
It's quite a trip because it ebbs and flows because there's been times where this case has calmed down and we don't see a stretch of much activity for months. And then when something hits like a national program or even a local report or even something that we break and put out there, then we start to see a flood of tips.
Imagine what the families go through. How many times do they hear something? Tara, you've seen that, yeah.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Imagine how many times, how it feels for us. Imagine being Joanne. I mean, and hearing these things and having people come to you and say, this is it, this is the one. Or every single time that you think that they seem to be getting close to something and they're digging for something and they aren't even saying what it is. And then having that hope build up. And there's a local case in Florida, in Orlando, Jennifer Kessie, and her family goes through this all the time in Orlando, where they find something and they think it's possibly her. I've spoken to her father on multiple occasions, and hearing that pain in his voice just kills you. And she has only been missing, for half the time that Jodi has. So, and they do have surveillance video, and they do have some of those perks that law enforcement has to look into her case, but it still hasn't gone anywhere. So it's a very difficult thing for all these families. And for us, it's something it's there, and we obviously all care a lot, but it's not our family member. So I can't even imagine.
You know what I still find amazing though, when I started looking or being part of FindJodi and looking into missing persons, how many thousands of missing persons there are out there.
Mm-hmm.
How never to be found. And I was just looking now, and there's some cases that 35 years later they find the remains, and I just can't imagine. Well, Mason City, every time they announce that there's some human remains found, I'm sure Joanne and the family is there. Everybody perks up. We all perk up on FindJodi. Anytime we hear the news, some remains were found, and it's like, is this the one? It's just, I can't imagine being a family member and hearing any kind of news, and you get your hopes up that maybe finally we can bring Jodi home and her remains put to rest. And it's got to be tough.
And that's a good point, Jay, because a lot of times in the past we've taken flack for why Jodi gets all this attention, why not the other thousands of missing person cases? Why don't they get the resources you guys are pouring into this case? And hey, I hear that. I hear my co-anchor, her daughter's missing, and they're not doing a podcast and a website and everything about that. It's the unfortunate reality of this situation. I think Jodi's case resonated with a lot of us journalists. That's why we picked up on it, and that's why we really honed in on it. And over time, it just grew into what it is today. So she had that benefit. So I think that is part of the answer, but I totally get people who want to challenge us on that. It's frustrating. And if I could divide our team into 1,000 people and 1,000 teams, we'd love to just tackle every case, and hopefully we'd solve half of them. And there are organizations out there that do a good job of dedicating their time to solve these cases. So I'm glad those teams are out there to do that.
I've learned this lesson myself the hard way over the years, to be extremely careful to not to raise those hopes. We're publishing for the public, but we're also, we have to be conscious of the family's going to see this as well, obviously. So I think we do a very good job of looping in the family members and the friends before we post something, just to give them a heads up. If you hear something about this, or if you see something like this, this is what we know and this is what we're posting ahead of time, so they're not hearing it secondhand, out of context, maybe from somebody else.
And Caroline is great about that with the family. She reaches out to Joanne. She reaches out to the family to say, hey, we're thinking about running this. Adequate heads up to make sure they know before we run anything that's sensitive. So from a team perspective, I'm proud of the fact that we do that, because they're going to see it and it's going to really have an impact. So I think that's important.
Well, Josh, years ago when I was a brand new reporter, I did a story on a search warrant on a little girl in St. Paul, Cassie Hansen, who was kidnapped and found murdered. And I did a story, and I never forget talking to her mother the next day. I hadn't called her mother, and she said, I thought you were different from the other reporters. I can't believe you did this. And I hung up and I sobbed, and it stayed with me for 40 years because I was just doing my job, just the facts. But for her, finding out in her living room was horrible. And, we don't get trained for a lot of what we do in terms of the people part of it. It's something you kind of develop as you go. Right. But it stayed with me. And I have Cassie's picture here in my office as a reminder to think of it if it's your family.
I just think of one thing that, Jodi's family must deal with a lot, is that when these remains are found or these cases are solved, the anger, to look back and be like, why not us? We've been waiting 25 years,
Yes.
It's been a couple months. And I personally feel that feeling must just be so intense. And it really, really resonates with me as a mom, as a sister, as a daughter, and thinking about those things and thinking, gosh, I would use words right now that I probably should, I just would really, really, really make you mad, because it's not fair, and there's nothing fair about this. But when, we get these calls or we have a tip and we do have to tell them, hey, they're looking for something, and then they get anxious, a little hopeful, but a little anxious, I'm sure, overall. And then they say, it's someone else's family getting that news. And after 25 years, that feeling has to get old.
Can't imagine. Just cannot imagine.
So somebody asked me again this week, another question I probably didn't know how to answer well. Do you feel like you know Jodi in some way, at some connection, just because of this work?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's she's been ingrained in my head so much that I feel like I know who she is. The sarcastic, joking, like ridiculous side of me would give her crap about her delivery just because I'm so critical about the way I was in TV. And I think that would be a weird way of us to connect, because she was even, critiquing herself in her journal. She had that Minnesota accent. It was so thick, and I'm from Minnesota, so I had the same thing. And that's something she wanted to work through. And that really resonated with me because I had the same thing. And I went from Minneapolis to Austin, Minnesota to Tucson, Arizona, and had to lose that in a hurry. So to see that, and, I think about how she and I would interact as people. It's very strange because we've never met, but to work on a case so much, you think you know the person. So absolutely.
You've talked about sitting on the couch with her. You said one day, we've talked about this before. He said, I can't imagine, if there's some crazy twist and some strange universe that we were able to sit on the same couch and have a conversation. He's like, can you imagine just sitting there and looking at her?
Right.
I'm like,
Wow.
you've talked about this a few times.
Yeah.
I think when I look at the billboard, and we dedicated him 2 years ago, one of the things I said that really stayed with me is her picture should be up on the billboard in the Twin Cities. I mean, she easily could have been out covering the pandemic and the protests right now instead of being a billboard in Mason City.
Mm-hmm.
Her happy, beautiful, smiling face and people asking, do you know something? Is it you? And I've thought I easily could have worked with her. She wanted to work in the Twin Cities, and I don't have the anchor ability that Josh and she had, but I think I would have had fun working on a crime story and kind of sharing what I was working on and trying to help her get used to the bigger market, just the reality of navigating a bigger newsroom. I think I would have really enjoyed that mentoring part if I could have had that chance.
And she was driven. I mean, based on the journal and just based on what her friends said, she wanted to get out of Mason City. She's like, I'm ready to move on. And she was frustrated. Yeah. She's like, let's get going. She's looking at Kathy Lee Gifford. She's looking at all these people that were real prominent at the time saying, how do I get to the network? How do I get to the Twin Cities? How do I get this, this delivery a little tighter? So she was actively working on it. And I admire that, because anybody who's been in TV who knows how they climb the ladder, it was all critical about your appearance, your delivery, your journalism, your storytelling. It's like a checklist. And she was on that checklist, knocking things off the list.
It's impacted me talking to people who knew her well outside of her family, and knew her well only for a short period of time and so long ago, and they're still very emotional about what happened to her and what she could have been. I think that speaks a lot about Jodi.
She had so many friends. I was just talking with her friend Stacy. She was supposed to be in Stacy's wedding that following Saturday, and just talking about seeing Jodi at her stagette party and just at the top of her life. And to think they still live with this. They still live with what happened. And so many friends, just so many. And she's always sending cards. We've heard a number of people who received birthday cards or notes right after she disappeared. She just seemed to be, that was really part of who she was.
And as we kind of wrap this up, I want to get reflections from everybody. What 25 years means to you, what you're kind of individually thinking this week as we approach the anniversary this weekend, and also, your time with the FindJodi team.
As I reflect on this, I've only been part of the FindJodi team almost 7.5 years, and Jodi's been missing 25. But going back to 1997, I feel I've been part of it going that far back, and it's a long time. I get asked almost every day, people at the golf course, people in my life, what's new in the case, and I just feel it's a privilege to be part of the team and to be able to talk about it. I really honestly feel that this is going to be solved. Not this year, maybe not next year, but, hopefully, it comes 30 years for her anniversary where it's been solved and we can talk about and evaluate what happened. Take that investigation and just tear it apart and try to educate others. And I always thought once this case is solved, I could take this to law enforcement agencies and do some training. I've talked to my replacement a number of times when I retired, who's in charge of investigations now, and just telling him, what could happen when you get a major case like this. I went to the FBI National Academy, and they always told us that there's going to be one case. It's going to be the most remarkable case, memorable case in your law enforcement career. Even though this case wasn't the Woodbury Police Department's case, it is one of the most remarkable, memorable cases I've been part of.
Caroline?
I'm again looking at Jodi's picture as we're talking, and I feel a mixture of the personal sadness that I've been on this journey from my end for about 23 years. I never would have imagined, as I'm looking at a coffee mug that I got when I visited her newsroom 23 years ago, never would have imagined that we'd still be grasping with what happened to her. I'm grateful that we have this team, that we have a structure to keep going. And I just hope, just doing this podcast today, I feel energized. I get so much from all of you, and we get so much from the people who reach out to us. So it's a deep resolve. I guess it's humbling. I really thought we could have been part of getting it solved sooner. At the end of the day, there's still a sense of unfinished business that if maybe I made one more call or I did a little more digging or a little more reading, I could find answers. And so I resolved just to keep going until we have answers.
Tara?
To echo some of Caroline's sentiments, I think that all of us want to find an end to this. But I'm going to quote, the Mason City Police Chief. He said this week, do something for Jodi and her family. And I hope that the Mason City Police Department does that. For me, that's something that is a little bit frustrating. I look at some of what's there, and I hope that they allow some outside people to come in and take a look at the case, because we're not getting anywhere. And I just want some closure for her family and for Jodi. She deserves that. And she was a digger, and she tried to find things, and it's only fair. So I truly hope that the police department follows up with what they're saying, and they, put in the work, because there's only so much we can do if we don't have the access to these files and the access to the information. And, for Jodi and her family, like they say, we need to do something. And I hope that's what happens.
And first of all, in the time that we've had this conversation, the phone has rang twice from the FindJodi tip line. And I just had my phone ping with 3 stories on Jodi, KIMT, and some other news sources. So, it's in the news. It's active tips are coming in. This is something where I look back at it and I'm frustrated. I think that's the biggest word for me. It's more frustrating than anything, because I feel like, wow, this should have been solved by now, but it's not. And I feel like we've done a great job. I feel like we've put as much energy into this thing as we possibly could, and we're still going. And this conversation tonight has just felt great. We haven't had a chance to get together like this because of this pandemic. First of all, this pandemic is just crushing everyone. And the fact that we can get together and sit and chat has been so cathartic for me and for the case, that I feel like it's just kind of, this is what happens every time we have a lull in this case. 3-4 months or 2 months, we start having conversations. I get excited again. It fires me up and it starts that fire in the system again. And that's where I'm at right now. So this is kind of the eternal flame that continues with me on this case. And I think the team is the thing that drives me to do that. If I didn't have this team, I would have been out a long time ago, and I would have put in the time and said, that's all I can do. But I see a lot of passion in this team. I see a lot of dedication. We're not getting paid to do this. We're just trying to help and try to find the answers for the family. And the answers are out there. And what's exciting to me is we have such a case file now that is so deep that I feel like if we spend some time going through the video and going through the notes and going through everybody's emails, you start piecing that together. Gary was a big advocate of this too. Let's go back. He'd say, Josh, let's go back and let's figure out from 93 to 95. He would set up the story. And I learned a lot from Gary. He would say, let's go back and revisit the notes. Let's go, because how are you going to remember what you talked about in 2003, 2004? I think the answers are in those emails. They're in the correspondence. They're in the video. And all we can do is keep generating the leads to look back, cross-reference the notes. And if people can reach out and talk to us, that's what's going to solve the case. So I'm hopeful, and I think this can get done.
Again, I'm glad we brought up Gary a couple of times, and the other members of the team too who have helped out over the years. But Gary, I have a fun Gary story. I didn't know him well at all, but the last time I saw him was at the Billboard unveiling 2 years ago now. And I was just talking to him, kind of introducing myself, just chatting. And he turned around to someone, might have been Caroline, and said, "Where'd that guy go? Where'd that man go?" and I realized that he was checking on adult male, people who were in attendance of a certain age.
Oh, yeah.
Trying to verify.
I don't doubt it.
I said, wow.
The guy's an old school gumshoe, man.
Yeah.
Like Gary is legit.
Yeah.
Like he is always on point, studying the crowd, figuring out who's around. Like he's thinking all the time, which was so cool to work with.
I've always had a lot of reverence for him just reading the website, and he wrote a post I think about a lot. I've thought about it a lot this week leading up to the anniversary, where you can tell from the writing, it's clear that man sat in the parking lot at that time of the day just to see what the environment and the conditions, were like.
I have the video.
I think it was the open letter to Jodi's killer post.
Yeah. No, Gary actually, with his wife Gladys, went and took the RV down to Mason City, parked it across the street at the church, woke up at that time, and walked with a video camera through the parking lot, down through to the Winnebago River, and got just the vibe of what the scene was at that time of day near that date. And he got it all on video. We have that video. So, I mean, that's the dedication that Gary and Gladys put into this case.
Well, and what he was doing is what you hear from your best homicide investigators, that the crime scene talks to you. Go to the scene. And I think there are things you get when you're there that you can't get on the internet. Let it talk to you. And if you're listening carefully.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Gladys, Gary's wife. Gladys has been the powerhouse behind Gary for a million years. I mean, she has been his sidekick, his support staff. She has cooked me many meals. Tara and I stayed at their house, and they have been so good to us over the past. And they're both death scene investigators, which by the way, I just wanted to bring up because that just shows how unique these people are and dedicated to the craft. But she makes a mean set of spare ribs. So Gary and Gladys, if you're listening, I love you, and I've appreciated everything you guys have ever done.
Things people can do, no matter how silly you think your information is, no matter how much you think it's going to waste police time or the time of whoever you're going to send it to, just take the action, send it. And because you never know, at this point, 25 years on, it's going to be probably in this case somebody's niece, somebody's cousin who finds something in an attic, something like that.
We've always said the smallest tip can crack this thing wide open. And people think, oh, my tip's not going to do much. But as you said, Scott, it will. And the challenge we're facing is the further away we get from that date, the older people get. My memory's going. I mean, I'm not even 45 yet, and my memory's going. So that's scary. But to think about how people just have to remember what they remember from Mason City at the time, that's helpful information to us. So they should send it to us, and we can look into it.
And even if you don't have information, if you want to get involved in the journey to find Jodi, we have a flyer you can download from our website. We're asking you people to turn on the lights this week, porch light. There are things you can do. We are creating a new Instagram account with photos, just a lot of ways you can get involved in the journey for Jodi. And you never know where that flyer you post, that coffee shop you may leave it in, somebody might see something, who knows something.
And one shameless plug just for the site and for the team. For those listening now, we don't make any money from this, obviously. This has been a volunteer operation from the very beginning, and we rely on donations to pay for pretty much anything we need to keep the mission going, whether that's to get court records, that's hosting on the website, that's, anything we need, travel. It's expensive for Caroline to fly from California to Mason City, or from Scott to drive around, 2,000 miles around, central Iowa. These are things we got to pay for out of pocket. So if you can give us $1, that's going to help. And that's just findjodi.com/donate. Very easy. You can donate via PayPal or from the embedded form that's there. It's Fundly. It's very secure. If you're not around a computer, too, anonymous phone tips, 970-458-JODI, 970-458-JODI. That's for an anonymous phone tip. You can leave a voicemail up to 3 minutes. If you run out of time, just call back. Otherwise, if you go to the website, findjodi.com/contact-us, or just hit the contact button, you can leave a question or a comment. Or if you want to, you can leave an anonymous message by clicking the link, type in your message, and submit. If you don't want to give your name or your information, just leave your note there, and we will take a look at it.
Something a little bit different, a roundtable conversation, a reflection of now, amazingly, 25 years since Jodi Huisentruit's disappearance, which remains unsolved today. But hopefully, There is much more on Jodi's case to come.